Good evening, everyone. My name is Antonio Sennis, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you this evening on behalf of the History Department to Professor Rebecca Jennings' inaugural lecture. This evening, we come together to celebrate Professor Jennings not only as a distinguished scholar, but as a valued member of our academic community. To help us do so, we will also hear from another distinguished scholar, Professor Matt Cook from the University of Oxford, who will formally introduce Rebecca's lecture. Inaugural lectures are significant milestones in the life of a university department. For the speaker, they mark a pivotal moment in their career, both highly symbolic and profoundly real. For the department, they are an opportunity to celebrate the achievements of one of our own. There are also occasions for welcome. We open our doors to colleagues from outside our department, from our faculty, from other institutions, to mentors who have guided the speaker's journey, and to family and friends who share in their pride and joy. But inaugural lectures serve a broader purpose as well. They remind us that the role of academics, especially historians, is not defined solely by our research outputs, conference presentations, articles, and books, however much they may shine under the bright lights of ref success and academic prizes. Our role is also deeply embedded in the communities we are part of and in the ways we engage with the world beyond our immediate scholarly circles. In a sense, we are here this evening to celebrate not just scholarly achievements, but the profound impact that a colleague has within and beyond our university. Rebecca's trajectory has been nothing short of extraordinary. From her initial appointment as a teaching fellow to her rapid progression through the ranks of lecturer, associate professor, and now professor, she has demonstrated an astonishing level of intellectual ambition, scholarly innovation, and professional dedication. Her rise has been meteoric and truly reflects not only the excellence of her work, but also the deep respect and admiration that she commands within the department and within UCL, broadly speaking. Rebecca's arrival at UCL coincided with a profound transformation in the way in which we in our department and our students engage with modern history, and indeed history more broadly. Her scholarship has been pioneering in its focus on queer history, but her intellectual impact extends far beyond that field. Her monographs, from Tomboys and Bachelor Girls to Unnamed Desires and Lesbian Intimacies and Family Life, are testament to her ability to reclaim the experiences of ordinary and often marginalized individuals, restoring them as central agents of historical change. This approach has been widely recognized both nationally and internationally. And yet, the significance of Rebecca's work is not confined to the study of sexuality and gender alone. Her commitment to oral history, personal testimonies, and the role of memory in shaping historical narratives has made her research indispensable to scholars across numerous historical subfields. And I speak as a medievalist, you know. Her work challenges us to think in new ways about identity, agency, and the intersections of personal and collective histories. The impact of Rebecca's work is equally profound in the classroom. She is an outstanding teacher whose influence on students, both undergraduate and postgraduate, cannot be overstated. Her ability to communicate complex ideas with clarity and passion inspires students to engage critically with historical narratives, to question assumptions, and to reflect on their own identities in relation to the past. She's a role model in every sense, empowering students to see themselves as active participants in historical inquiry, particularly those whose own experiences or interests might not have been reflected in traditional historiographies. Her commitment to inclusive teaching and innovative assessment practices and to diversifying the curriculum makes her an invaluable presence within our department. Within UCL, Rebecca's leadership and service exemplify the very best of academic citizenship. As our departmental admissions tutor, She has been extraordinary, spearheading efforts in diversification and widening participation with exceptional care and effectiveness. At faculty level, as Vice Dean for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, her contributions have been equally transformative. Her efforts have reinforced UCL's commitments to fostering an inclusive and intellectually dynamic academic environment. Beyond UCL, Rebecca's contribution to public history demonstrate the remarkable breadth of her influence. Her works reaches well beyond academia, shaping broader societal discussion on gender, sexuality, and historical memory. Rebecca, Professor Jennings, is quite simply an outstanding scholar, teacher, and colleague. Her research has reshaped the field of queer history, her teaching has inspired students, and her leadership is contributing to make our institution a better, more inclusive place. In a nutshell, Rebecca's work within the department, the faculty, UCL, and the wider community is what we are here to celebrate this evening. So from me, and on behalf of all the department, thank you, Professor Jennings, and well done. It's now a real pleasure and an honor for me to welcome Professor Matt Cook from the University of Oxford and ask him to introduce formally Professor Rebecca Jennings' inaugural lecture. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. It really is a real honor to be invited. It was a real honor to be invited to introduce Rebecca's scholarship today. She is a pioneer of lesbian history. First in and of Britain, then in and of Australia, and in her latest landmark book on the two countries together. Rebecca established her reputation as a leading scholar in the field with two books published in 2007, an impressive feat in itself. A Lesbian History of Britain looks across more than 500 years and vividly demonstrates shifting meanings attached to love and sex between women, and including the ways in which class and locality mattered, and how ideas of identity, community, and politics formed unevenly and equivocally across these centuries. It remains a go-to text for a wide readership, reaching, characteristically for Rebecca's work, well beyond an academic audience. Tomboys and Bachelor Girls, her other book of that year, focused more tightly on post-war Britain. It brought us a highly textured account of lesbian social scenes and networks in London, but also across the country, demonstrating that the austere conservative image of post-war Britain really needed nuancing. Women were finding ways individually, but especially together, to forge a sense of difference and also to have fun, something that I think we've started to see as political in itself. The book, and a wonderful associated journal piece, also touches the significance of age and intergenerational frictions in lesbian subculture, something we've seen too in lesbian history as it's developed over the last few years especially. Rebecca's work is grounded in cultural, social, and oral history, seeking out how ordinary lives were lived and experienced, and what they came to mean for others. These questions are centrally at stake in Unnamed Desires, a Sydney lesbian history of 2015, a book which charted for the first time lesbian experiences in and beyond the city from the 1930s through to the first Mardi Gras in 1978. With her unerring eye to the particularity of lived experience, she locates the different and also intersecting dynamics of urban and rural in a book which takes in Sydney, but also wider New South Wales. The domestic features in each of these works as a key space of lesbian self-making. But in her latest book, Lesbian Intimacies and Family Life, which was published in 2023, the focus is very centrally on home and family, taking us on a journey through lesbian sex, relationships, domesticity, family formation, and kinship and support since the war. She consistently reminds us that these things have taken different forms, shaped by the pragmatics of circumstance, by wider expectation and the law, and often by a political drive and determination to do things differently in urban households and rural lesbian communities. Comparing Britain and Australia, something that hadn't been done before, gives a cumulative sense of shared norms, values, countercultures and politics, sustained and fuelled often by literal moves across the globe. But we also get a sense of the subtle rather than stark differences in cultures of lesbian intimacy, possibility and family in each place. Like her other work, Lesbian Intimacies is an inspiring and deeply moving book in which we witness women forging lives in the context of difficult and sometimes accommodating marriages, with and without children, and that in the face of anticipated or actual community and social censure. The way the book explores family making, including via artificial insemination, takes seriously the roles of all the women involved, the position of being non-biological mother or part of a network of care, sustained by commitment and a powerful sense of kinship, something misunderstood beyond those circles and certainly unprotected by the law. Oral history is, again, the linchpin. Professor Jennings is a brilliant practitioner. Her testimonies allow us to see how concepts of motherhood and mothering shifted, and how women found ways to be the parents they wanted to be to children whose voices in the book validate their decisions. Lesbian mothers, she shows, helped shift the dial and the social scripts about parenthood and family, and were not only subject to them. Rebecca works under the banner of the history of sexuality and the history of gender, and within that demonstrates the enduring significance of focused lesbian historical work. In the everyday, legal, economic and cultural detail she marshals, we are reminded again and again about the particular impacts of the way women have been positioned socially, culturally and economically, and how the social lives, relationships and families they form have been judged and policed in very particular ways, and in relation to trenchant ideas about womanhood, motherhood, and the way lesbianism overlaps with, but is also seen to be distinct with, in tension with both. So it's probably clear by now that I'm a fan. And so I was really delighted to get the opportunity to work directly with Rebecca on a queer scrapbook of Britain and Ireland, alongside trans historian and curator E.J. Scott and queer historian Justin Bengry. I've seen firsthand the rigour and care that goes into her work, and also how much fun she is to collaborate with. I like to think that there's been a sense of working on this project in the collective spirit that characterised the first waves of lesbian and gay history in the 1970s and early 1980s, and which I know inspire us both. It's clear in her work that she, like those earlier pioneers, sees the personal as political and both as profoundly historical. As with that earlier generation, accessibility matters. Rebecca's nuanced, robust histories are hugely engaging and reach with enviable ease across the academic, popular history divide. She shows to this wide readership the complexity of lived experience and the significance of race, of class, of differences in gender to the way in which lesbian lives are lived. Her findings echo through our present and can help us to confound the simplistic, historically tone-deaf messaging of the rising authoritarian right. What she recounts of the past thus matters deeply in our present. This, I know, will emerge further in her current project on the entanglement of trans and lesbian subjectivities since the war, and it will emerge too in the lecture we're about to hear.
Thank you so much, Matt and Antonio, for those lovely words. And I just wanted to thank all of you for coming. It's wonderful to see so many of my colleagues in the department and the faculty and across the university and beyond, and also my students. And I also wanted to just give a special shout out to my family and to say thank you very much for all of your support over the years. My parents dragged me to National Trust properties as a child, so I think can claim credit for my early passion for history. And my partner Vicky and I are now enacting the same torture on our own children, so hopefully we have a future generation of historians in the making. And I do also want to take the opportunity to thank my partner Vicky, who has read every single thing I've ever written in the last 25 years, I think, and listened to me going on and on in coffee shops and walks about my various ideas. So yeah, none of this would be possible without her. I'd like to begin with a brief anecdote. In June 2017, I attended the Berks, the major international conference in women's and gender history, which takes place in North America every 4 years. It was a fraught conference for a number of reasons. Earlier that year, Trump had issued an executive order banning the issuance of visas to citizens of a range of predominantly Muslim countries. And this not only prevented speakers from the affected countries from attending, but also deterred many other international and US participants who felt that it was unsafe to travel to or within the US. Panels across the conference were depleted or cancelled altogether, and the conference proceeded with a profound sense of the limits of international academic exchange. In addition to my planned paper, I was drafted in at the last minute to replace the speaker on a round table on the theme of difficult conversations in lesbian history. In our short discussion papers, my fellow speakers and I covered themes such as youth, sex, and religion, but when we opened up to a wider discussion from the room, the audience members had a different, difficult conversation that they wished to discuss. A North American academic shared an experience she'd recently had while teaching the history of post-war butch femme bar culture in the 1950s and 60s to a class of undergraduate students. One of her students, she reported, had challenged the authenticity of butch lesbian identities in the period with the observation, but surely if these people had had the opportunity to claim a trans identity, they would have done that instead. The academic called on the audience in our session to join her in expressing despair and outrage at her students' interjection, and more broadly to condemn what she perceived as a hostile incursion by trans scholars on the sacred lesbian ground of butch femme culture. They responded with enthusiasm to her call, collectively framing lesbian and trans histories and identities as both fundamentally distinct and mutually destructive. I was horrified by this expression of a divisive politics, which at the time we had yet to feel the full effects of in the UK. But I was also mystified as a historian by what seemed to me to be a fundamentally flawed understanding of the relationship between gendered and sexual subjectivities in the post-war decades. The obvious answer to the reported students' query seemed to me to be, well, those butch lesbians did have an opportunity to claim a trans identity. Certainly in the US and British press, sex changes were regularly being reported from the 1930s onwards, and US trans pioneer Christine Jorgensen's story was serialized in 5 parts in American Weekly in early 1953. So it was possible, indeed likely, that many of those butch lesbians in the bar culture would have been aware of these trans stories. So the question of identity categories was clearly more complex than a simple binary choice that she seemed to be representing. In the years since the 2017 conference, I've been mulling over the wider implications of that difficult conversation until it's taken shape as a new project, which I would like to think through with you this evening, and that's really what this lecture is about. So my goal with this work is to trouble what Mo Moulton has referred to as the gender, sex, sexuality schema, and to argue that in the 2 decades or so after the Second World War, the entanglement of concepts of gender, sex, and sexuality, which was characteristic of late 19th and early 20th century Western thinking, remained quite firmly in place. Indeed, while many historians have assumed that by the mid-century, popular understandings of gender and sexuality broadly reflected concepts that we use today, I want to suggest that the post-war decades were in fact a crucial period in which those categories as we understand them were only gradually coming into being. To illustrate what I mean by this, I want to begin with a brief historical overview of the concepts sex, gender, and sexuality before moving on to consider how the gendered and sexual subjectivities of one person, Diana Chapman, can help us to trace the shifting discourses circulating at this time and the ways in which individuals engaged with these discourses to shape their sense of self. So to start with sex. Ancient and medieval texts, historians of the body tell us, typically presented the human body as a single type, with slight variations between the male and female body, in this diagram on the right of the vagina as an inverted form of the penis. Gradually, between the early modern period, a conceptual shift occurred from what Lecoeur influentially characterized as the one-sex to the two-sex model. The sexes came to be understood as dimorphic. Male and female bodies were not mirror images of each other, but rather structurally distinct, each designed differently to meet the specific reproductive roles of the two sexes. This concept of two sexes gained cultural ground in the 19th century through a range of historical processes. So in the era of high imperialism, a binary model of sex-gender was mobilized in the service of colonial power structures to assert the racial and cultural distinctiveness and superiority of European colonizers. In the metropole, an understanding of masculine and feminine nature as intrinsically different but complementary underpinned the construction of a distinctive moral industrial middle class. Its influence became so great that as successive generations of scientific researchers sought to understand new elements of the human body, from the discovery of chromosomes in the late 19th century to a developing knowledge of hormones in the early 20th century, they interpreted their findings in relation to an assumed scientific fact of sexual dimorphism, further cementing an unassailable belief that nature had divided humans into two discrete sexes, male and female. The term gender, in its modern sense of a set of cultural ideas or expectations which are ascribed to sex, has two origin stories. Historians typically locate the emergence of gender in post-68 feminist theorizing. British sociologist Anne Oakley, for example, argued in her 1972 book, Sex, Gender and Society, that gender is a matter of culture. It refers to the social classification into masculine and feminine. For feminist scholars and activists of the 1970s and early 1980s, this insistence on masculinity and femininity as social roles offered a crucial theoretical basis for a political project which aimed to reshape social structures and cultural attitudes that were perceived to oppress women. In the late 80s and early 90s, important interventions by Joan Scott and Judith Butler noted the role of gender as a signifier of relationships of power and problematized the sex-gender distinction. So that's origin story number one. More recently, intersex and trans scholars and historians of medicine and the body have noted that the term had already been in use for over a decade before feminist theorists took it up. In the 1950s, John Money and his colleagues at Johns Hopkins University coined the term gender role as a tool for ascribing intersex individuals to a male or female category of sex. Money posited that sex was determined by 7 variables: chromosomal sex, gonadal sex, internal sex, external morphologic sex, hormonal sex, and sex of assignment or rearing. And finally, gender role. As his research on intersex led him to conclude that the first 6 elements of sex were potentially unstable and could work independently from or in contradiction to each other, Money proposed the concept of gender role to resolve this uncertainty. He saw gender as having both interior and exterior expression, but understood it to be relational and, in the words of intersex historian David Rubin, socially plastic. In developing a treatment protocol for intersex, therefore, Money argued that if intersex infants were assigned a sex at birth, were subjected to surgical intervention to ensure that their genitalia corresponded with that sex, and then were reared uncompromisingly in the matched gender, confusion could be avoided and a binary order of sex-gender could be maintained. Okay, on to our final category, sexuality. Since Michel Foucault's widely cited claims in the history of sexuality, historians have broadly accepted that sexuality acquired its contemporary meaning as a category of identity or subjectivity in the modern period. Famously declaring the sodomite had been a temporary aberration, the homosexual was now a species, Foucault asserted that sexuality changed from being a list of acts or practices to a type of person with a morphology. He positioned this development in the late 19th century, and in the case of homosexuality, pinpointed it with apparent precision to the year 1870. More recently, typically Foucauldian move there, more recently scholars have questioned his periodization. So in the field of lesbian history, for example, Laura Doan asserts that the women she researched for her study of First World War and interwar sexual subjectivity did not seem to ever speak of themselves or others in reference to modern categories of sexual identity. So she had a kind of fundamental problem with her project, which she resolved beautifully through a theoretical analysis of how we approach the history of sexuality. By the post-Second World War period, however, historians, myself included, have typically assumed that relatively stable understandings of distinct sexual categories, not unlike our own, were available and utilised by individuals seeking to understand themselves and those around them. But as I will argue this evening, I'm now not sure that we can assume this, and I want to think more carefully about this concept of sexuality in this period. So, focusing on the decades between the Second World War and the social movements of the 70s and 80s, I want to argue that a conceptual shift took place from a gender-sex-sexuality schema in which notions of gender, sex, and sexuality were entangled with each other, to one in which sex, gender on the one hand, and sexuality on the other were understood to be distinct. Or, to put it differently, a shift from a perspective in which sexual practices and identities were explained in terms of gender to one in which the categories of homosexuality and transsexuality were considered to have distinct etiologies and social implications. In order to properly understand this process, we need to try to approach the post-war decades with fresh eyes and on their own terms, rather than as the precursor to the feminist and gay liberation movements of the 70s. Historians of sexuality have increasingly noted the tendency of LGBT+ and queer histories to practice what Laura Doan calls ancestral genealogy, an approach in which historians trace back from the present moment to identify the precursors or origins of identities and practices familiar to us today. While there are clear and justifiable reasons for this approach, it risks blinding us to the radical differences of the past and to the messiness and ruptures of historical time. So instead, with trans historian Kaji Amin, I want to adopt an approach which understands historical time not as a causal straight line, but as a fragmented and tangled network of ruptures, continuities, reversals, and reconfigurations. They're wonderful words, not mine. My lecture this evening will focus on a case study of Diana Chapman. Chapman was born in Bristol in 1928, the only child of a couple who had married late. After an education disrupted by the war and her parents' ill health and early deaths, she ultimately qualified and worked as a dentist and lived in London for most of her adult life. She was a founding member of the Minorities Research Group, which published Britain's first lesbian magazine between 1964 and 1971, and was also instrumental in the establishment of Britain's oldest lesbian social organisation, Kenrick. Through her active involvement in the formation of lesbian communities in the 1960s and 1970s, she narrated personal testimonies 4 times in different formats across 3 decades. In early 1963, she authored what is possibly the first explicitly lesbian published autobiographical account, in response to an article on lesbianism in the quarterly journal 20th Century. In 1971, her emotional autobiography was one of 3 published in psychologist Charlotte Wolfe's book, Love Between Women. A decade later, she narrated a detailed oral history interview with Margot Farnham for the Hall Carpenter Lesbian and Gay collection. And in 1988, she was interviewed again for the documentary Women Like Us, subsequently published in a collection of interviews. Her defining statement of lesbianism in 1963 and her subsequent ubiquitous presence in all the key collections of lesbian personal testimony produced in the 1970s and 1980s cement her position as a central figure in the formation of British lesbian community. And yet, her accounts trouble many of the scholarly and popular assumptions about lesbian subjectivity in this period. Through an analysis of these statements of self, I hope to draw attention to the blurred boundaries of categories of gendered and sexual identity in the decades after the war. Chapman's accounts provide a fascinating and rare opportunity to consider her gender and sexual subjectivities and the cultural frameworks on which she drew to make sense of her selfhood. So to be clear, I am not intending to dispute Chapman's claiming of a lesbian identity or to retrospectively assign her to another category of subjectivity, but rather to highlight the pitfalls of applying current conceptualizations of gender and sexual identity in the post-war period, and to emphasize the blurred meanings which were attached to the categories lesbian and transsexual in that historical moment. I'll do this in two ways. Firstly, by considering common themes in personal testimonies and narratives which have been labelled lesbian or trans, and also by reflecting on the key tropes in Chapman's accounts. And then secondly, by exploring the relationship between cultural scripts or discourse and individual subjectivity. So lesbian and trans narratives. A significant and growing scholarship on lesbian and gay and trans narrative has mapped out some defining elements of these accounts, suggesting that there are common themes which are characteristic of these forms of personal testimony. In his influential 1994 study, Telling Sexual Stories, sociologist Ken Plummer argued that coming out was the dominant narrative in stories by lesbian and gay narrators, because the most momentous act in the life of any lesbian or gay person is when they proclaim their gayness to self, to other, to community. He suggested that the coming out stories which were heard, especially during the 1960s and 70s, are usually modernist tales, and that they feel that they are discovering a truth. Most typically, the genre of coming out writing does the following. One, it starts in childhood and follows a linear progression. Two, childhood is usually seen as an unhappy time. Three, a crucial moment appears, often in early adolescence, where problems appear that lead to a concern or discovery over being gay. Four, problems are resolved in some fashion, usually through meeting other lesbians or gays in a community. And five, a sense of identity or self is achieved as gay or lesbian. Now, I am expecting you to memorize these because we're going to come back to these points later. For Plummer and others, the lesbian or gay narrative is typically structured as a journey during which the narrator overcomes often painful experiences or a sense of dislocation to achieve composure and positive acceptance as a gay subject. In his analysis of trans autobiographical accounts, J. Prosser has similarly characterized trans narratives as structured in the form of a journey, ultimately producing an integrated trans subject who unites the previously dislocated elements of self. Like Plummer, Prosser argues that the archetypal trans narrative also incorporates common phases, which he defines as suffering and confusion, self-discovery, corporeal and/or social transformation, and finally, reassignment. He identifies several key moments which typically feature in trans autobiography, including a moment of epiphany in which the subject recognizes their gendered difference, and a moment or process of transition. While many narratives dwell on surgical sex change as a moment of transition, this aspect of the narrative can occur in other forms, Prosser suggests. So a common example is the mirror scene, which marks a transitional moment both in the subject's transsexual trajectory, that's a tongue twister, and in the autobiographical narrative, when the difference between gender and sex is shown through the difference between body image, as exemplified in the projected self, and the image of the body, as exemplified in the reflected self. Beyond the formative person of narrative for the individual subject, scholars of lesbian and gay and trans narrative have also emphasized the community building functions of autobiography. Not only do pre-existing accounts shared as stories in lesbian and gay bars or published in community magazines or books provide lesbian or trans narrators with ready-made cultural scripts on which to draw in articulating their own subjectivity, but the act of laying claim to these familiar tropes is an act of solidarity, of staking a claim to membership in a lesbian or trans community. However, inevitably, not all autobiographical accounts conform to the generic characteristics, And scholars have noted the existence of marginalised accounts which fail to conform fully to the generic conventions of any single narrative form, and instead contain elements of one or more. And I would like to suggest that Diana Chapman's narratives occupy this liminal space. So through closely analysing the themes and concepts which appear in her accounts, we can get a deeper understanding of the complexities of notions of gender and sexuality in the post-war period, and the mechanisms through which individuals utilised available cultural concepts to make sense of themselves. So let's take a look at Diana Chapman. Chapman's 4 accounts present her subjectivity to varying degrees in terms of 2 central elements: her essential masculinity and her love for women. 3 of the narratives contain versions of a vivid story in which Chapman was confronted at the age of 5 with the concept of sexual difference. In her 1981 Hall Carpenter interview, she recounted the incident in these terms. I was a normal little girl until one day, in the back garden of 27 Claremont Road, something very peculiar happened. The little boy next door, whose name was Sidney Denby, was standing there waving his willy about, and I looked at this and thought, well, I haven't got one of those, it's not fair. And I thereupon decided that I was a boy. Of course, this was all very embarrassing, and I'm sure my mother hated it, and I'm sure that my grandmother and aunts and everybody sort of thought, how awful. But I simply completely rejected femaleness. Well, I wouldn't wear skirts, I wouldn't do anything. I mean, if women did it, then I wouldn't. You know, if boys did it, it was all right. And I chucked away all my dolls and acquired guns and things like that and rushed around the garden playing cowboys and Indians and Tarzan by myself. But it also manifested itself in another way, which of course I didn't recognize at the time. It also manifested itself as a sort of defeat, because from that time I developed a bad stoop, which of course was psychologically induced. I stooped and my schoolwork went to hell, and I think what I was experiencing was a kind of childhood depression, because of course I'd embarked on a battle with my body, which I could never win. Chapman's story, told with startling clarity and consistency across her various testimonies, functions as a moment of epiphany, I told you I was going to test you, which Prosser and others see as characteristic of trans autobiography. Moreover, it acts as a driving force in the narrative, underpinning a consistent, lifelong account of alienation from her female body. Later in her Hall Carpenter interview, Chapman describes puberty as a particularly challenging time, noting, adolescence had arrived. I'd grown a large bosom, I was menstruating like mad, I didn't know who I was or what I was, and I was depressed. Oh, I was just a bloody mess. Her discomfort with female embodiment was exacerbated by gynecological problems which caused heavy periods, and in her mid-30s she was offered a hysterectomy. She recalled, I was just delighted to have it, you see. Apart from the fact that I was having an awful lot of bleeding and fibroids and Christ knows what, I mean, the idea of never menstruating again was wonderful. And of course, I hadn't the slightest desire to have children. So when the surgeon said to me, because I had to go in for the usual investigation, he said, you've got quite a few fibroids. I more or less knocked him down in the rush to get to the operating theatre. Couldn't wait to get rid of my uterus. Well, in addition to resolving the physical pain, also the fact of not wanting to be female, you see. And I just wanted to get rid of the whole bang shoot, you know, which was doing me no good, had never done me any good all my life. I'd probably have had a double mastectomy at the time too if they'd have done it for me. So Chapman frames her hysterectomy in this account in terms of both a medical and a psychological resolution, enabling her to bring her painful experience of heavy bleeding to an end and to cast off an aspect of her body which she regarded as purposeless and alien. This sense of embodied dislocation was matched in the accounts by a strong sense of psychological masculinity. In her 1963 letter to 20th Century, Chapman asserted, personally, ever since the age of 5, I felt very strongly that I was a male who had, by some horrible cosmic mistake, been put into a female body, and thus forced into certain conventions of dress and behaviour, which I find alien. Of course, I cannot say I feel like a man, because I cannot possibly know this. What I can say, however, is that in a lot of instances I can understand the male reaction, whilst those of my own sex leave me baffled. Nor do I necessarily react to a given situation as a man would, much as I might wish to, because socially and physically it's usually impossible to do so. Chapman echoed this sense of feeling like a man trapped in a woman's body in her interview with Charlotte Wolfe a decade later, repeating that she found the attitudes and actions of men much easier to understand than those of women. She observed, "Would I have it any other way than being a lesbian? Yes, to have been born a man. Though what sort of man I would have been, I sometimes wonder. Often when I observe men acting in a deplorable way, I know only too well their motivation because I can see it in myself. Women are a mystery to me, but not men." Chapman's sense that the male social role was a much better fit with her subjectivity was repeated in other accounts. So in her Hall Carpenter interview, she explained, "What I passionately wanted was to be a man so that I could, as I saw it, fulfill my proper function. That if I were a man, I would be taking Jean to a dance. That if I were a man, I wouldn't be playing second fiddle to any chap who wanted to take her out. I wanted to be a male. I didn't see myself as female. And yet at the same time, I was under this awful pressure, as all women are, to try and behave like a female." Despite these assertions of psychic masculinity, however, there is no evidence to suggest that Chapman ever sought to claim a male social identity using male pronouns or changing her name. Oral histories and other evidence document the predominance of butch femme roles in the lesbian bar culture between the 1950s and 1970s, in which butch lesbians dressed in masculine clothing and adopted certain practices coded as male. Although Chapman was aware of this subcultural practice from at least the early 1960s, she rejected a butch role as not fitting her sense of self. She said, "In those days, the early 60s, one just accepted that there was this butch-femme divide. I never thought of myself as either butch or femme, although people used to try and push me into the butch category, but I never felt that I really belonged there. I didn't feel I belonged in the femme category either." This position aligned with a strongly asserted belief in the importance of conformity to middle-class social norms. In this, Diana Chapman was in some senses typical of the predominantly middle-class minorities research group lesbian community that she had co-founded. MRG's magazine, Arena 3, explicitly distanced itself from an urban bar scene which was perceived as typically working class and disreputable. And more generally, MRG and Arena 3 worked to promote an image of lesbians as, in Amy Tooth Murphy's words, normal. She claims, "A normal in this instance often meant conventionally middle class in appearance, ideology, and lifestyle. Keen to downplay lesbians' difference to the mainstream public, the MRG sought to present lesbians as intelligent, responsible, solvent, and appropriately feminine, in short, respectable." So, while several scholars have noted the class distinctions between a more visible and confrontational working class lesbian culture and a discrete, conformist middle class lesbian culture in the post-war decades, I think Chapman's accounts suggest a level of discomfort with the issue of appearance which went beyond what might be considered typical of her middle-class peers. An emphasis on what she termed decency recurs throughout Chapman's narratives. Describing her mother, Chapman told Charlotte Wolfe that decent was a great word of hers, and later implicated herself in similar values, claiming, "Had not my mother instilled into me the need to be decent?" Recalling her first encounter with her future MRG co-founder, Esme Langley, Chapman expressed horror at her inappropriate appearance, and she was similarly unsettled by questions of appropriate dress a year or two later, when MRG began hosting social events in a meeting room above the Shakespeare's Head pub in Carnaby Street. Although several co-founders and early members of MRG were interviewed for the Hall Carpenter Oral History Project, Chapman was the only one to recall this dispute, dwelling on it in detail in more than one of her personal testimonies. And this emphasis suggests that the deep impression this controversy had upon her, both at the time and the anxiety around it that was evident in her recollections. So she recalled, "I remember we had a very bitter debate on drag. Should women come dressed as men? Because once again, that was drawing attention to us. And also it meant that women who were terribly nervous and were really summoning up the courage to come at all would be frightened and put off. I was pretty conservative. I said I certainly wouldn't say that everybody's got to come looking like a normal woman, but I preferred people not to look too extremely masculine. Because I remember, you see, we used to have to go through the public bar. We couldn't say that we were a group of lesbians. We were we used to make out that we were a group of businesswomen or something just out on the town. And I remember one day, one tall young woman, looking every inch like a young man, started up the stairs. And of course, the landlord came and said, "Excuse me, sir, but that's women only up there." So that if you've got a whole lot of people dressed like Burton tailors marching up the stairs, it was jolly awkward. Chapman's description of this episode points to her ambivalence, suggesting, I think, a tension between her sympathy for those who wish to present in a masculine way and her need to avoid socially embarrassing situations which breached conventional norms. Her own self-presentation in this period was clearly shaped by her sense of anxiety about the consequences of nonconformity. She reflected in her Hall Carpenter interview, and of course in those days you didn't walk around with cropped hair and trousers like you do now, not unless you wanted to be seen. I mean, not unless you wanted to be pointed out in the street. So I sort of wore ordinary women's clothes and passed, as it were. I think the language there is really telling as well, this idea of not unless you want to be seen. And then she kind of qualifies it to being pointed out. But there is this kind of thread that runs through her narratives about wanting to be invisible, I think. The second key element in Chapman's narratives was the theme of falling in love with women, which framed several of the accounts. So in her 1963 letter to 20th Century, the first 2 points that Chapman makes centre on the nature of lesbian love, arguing that it is an authentic mode of sexual self-expression and that loving women comes as naturally to lesbians as does loving men to their heterosexual counterparts. Her personal experience of passionate attachments was presented as a driving force in her life story in several accounts. Early in her Hall Carpenter interview, Chapman declared, "When I was 12, I think I was walking along the edge of a swimming pool, and there was a tall, dark, and handsome girl called Eleanor Ackroyd, and she smiled at me. I fell in love passionately, and that was sort of the age of about 12. My passionate adoration of Eleanor Ackroyd was the beginning of my emotional life." This claim is underlined throughout the remainder of a long interview in which Chapman moves on to tell of her love for Jean in her late teens, falling madly in love with Sonia, a married woman in her early 20s, meeting Poppy, who fell madly in love with her and took her to Australia, moving in with Esme Langley, no mention of love there, for 18 months, before falling in love with another Jean, quote, who wasn't interested, and then a girl who turned out to be mad and returned to Birmingham soon after. She concludes her emotional autobiography for Charlotte Wolfe with the question, "What then do I really want? A succession of more or less disastrous idylls or a settled life? One cannot have both and one has to make a choice. At least by my age, one has to make a choice. Whether I have achieved sufficient insight to be able to dispense with the first, and if so, whether I shall be lucky enough to find a person with whom I can attempt the second, I do not know." By the 1980s, Chapman appeared to have found such a person, having embarked on a longer-term relationship with another Hall Carpenter interviewee, Rosanna Hibbush, on the right there. The powerful narrative of emotional love in Chapman's accounts is complicated, however, by a recurrent theme of discomfort and lack of fulfillment in relation to embodied desire and sexual practice. In response to a question about her knowledge of lesbian sex in the Hall Carpenter interview, Chapman responded, "Oh, good heavens, no. Oh, no. It was all a complete mystery to me. And the funny thing was, you see, but there again, you said you wanted to ask me about sex. I've never been able to reconcile sex and emotion. It all seems to me that sex is sort of like a bodily feeling which has absolutely nothing to do with any reasonable activity that you could conduct with another person." Although the interviewer framed the question in terms of knowledge or experience of sexual practice, Chapman's response moves beyond this time-specific issue of sex education to a broader question of embodied desire, noting her lifelong difficulty with experiencing sexual response. Clearly an issue which caused her some unease, Chapman suggests two possible explanations in her Charlotte Wolfe account. In the first instance, she emphasises her upbringing, pointing toward her mother's neurotic obsession with decency, and a wider cultural absence of sex education as an explanation for her inability to connect embodied experiences of sexual arousal with emotional responses of love towards another person. In the second, however, she implies a more fundamental absence of desire or physical response in her sexual interactions, commenting, Love was an emotion, nothing more. Physical contact to me at that time was symbolic, not erotic. Indeed, in some respects, it has for me remained at that. Chapman's account similarly diverges from other lesbian oral history narratives of the period in relation to the process of identity formation. As noted earlier, Ken Plummer suggests that claiming and articulating a lesbian identity provides the central structural logic underpinning lesbian oral history interviews, and it is this process which enables the narrator to present a composed and affirmative narrative of selfhood. This pattern is widely discernible across the Hall Carpenter collection in which Chapman's interview sits. However, the certainty with which Chapman presents her awareness of masculinity at the age of 5 contrasts with the lack of clarity and resolution relating to her lesbian identity. So in her account for Charlotte Wolfe's study, Chapman comments, "If I am asked, when did you first realize that you were a lesbian, I find it difficult to answer. The clarity of my childish perception about my nature blurred with the onset of the miseries of adolescence. As I grew older, I felt totally incapable of attracting the opposite sex, though I knew that society put a high premium on sexual attractiveness in women." So in a reversal of Plummer's typical pattern, which sees adolescence as a point in which lesbian and gay subjects begin to move from childhood experiences of unhappiness toward a growing sense of awareness of their homosexuality, paving the way for a subsequent sense of belonging in gay community, Chapman describes a blurring of clarity with the onset of adolescence. Unlike many of the classic lesbian and gay narratives, Chapman's accounts do not follow a typical coming out arc or produce a composed affirmative lesbian subject, despite her own and her interviewer's presumption of her lesbian identity. Okay, so I'd like to pause for a minute here to reflect on the implications of this discussion of narratives for the question that I initially posed about the categories lesbian, trans, or more broadly, the gender, sex, sexuality schema. And mostly I just want to remind everyone that, tempting as it may be, I want to reiterate that I do not think we should be trying to determine whether Diana Chapman was really a lesbian or really trans. I'm issuing this reminder because Vicky, in her read-through of this speech, said to me, everyone's going to have been sat there for the last half an hour thinking, but was she really a lesbian or was she really trans? That is not the question. Instead, what I've tried to show in this analysis of her narratives is that her testimonies contain both themes which we would now consider to be lesbian and themes which we would categorize as trans. That she nevertheless identified herself as a lesbian throughout the 1960s and 1970s, I think underlines 2 points. Firstly, the need for us to set aside our contemporary urge to understand gender, sex, and sexuality as disentangled in this period. And secondly, the need to reconsider any boundaries we may have drawn between the categories lesbian and trans in the post-war decades. So to help us to do this, I'd like to turn in the final section to consider the cultural scripts that Chapman drew on in making sense of her selfhood. In his work on oral history interviews with Australian First World War veterans, Al Thompson emphasises the extent to which individuals' narratives are shaped and constrained by available cultural scripts circulating at the time of the account. Diana Chapman's attempts to frame a composed personal narrative provide an insight into the models of gendered and sexual selfhood which were available to her in the mid-20th century in Britain. She identified 2 sources of information which shaped her understanding of herself in early adulthood. Firstly, at the age of 21, she read Radcliffe Hall's novel, The Well of Loneliness, which, after its banning in 1928, had recently been reissued by Falcon in 1949. Chapman bought her own copy for the extravagant price of 30 shillings and described reading it as a revelation. Recalling the experience in her Hall Carpenter interview, she explained, "I had a dentist appointment, and that particular dentist always kept you waiting at least an hour and a half. And so by the time I got into his chair, I'd read about a third of the book. I was shattered. I was hit for 6. I thought, this is me. This is what it's all about. I wept copiously. I went about in a daze." The novel charts the growing self-awareness of its central character, Stephen Gordon, who is born into the body of a girl, but whose mind and spirit are masculine and who loves women. Throughout the post-war period and in literary criticism of the 1980s and 1990s, The Well of Loneliness was understood as the classic British lesbian novel, And Chapman's account of reading it functions in her Hall Carpenter and her Women Like Us interviews as a defining moment in her realization of a lesbian identity. However, as Jack Halberstam notes, the novel occupies a complicated place in the history of lesbian fiction. Numerous lesbian feminist literary theorists have expressed discomfort with the novel's depictions of love between women as incomplete or unsustainable, and of a lesbian subculture as, and I quote from the novel, garish and tragic. Moreover, as Jay Prosser has noted, the novel does not actually mention the term lesbian, which was not widely used in the 1920s when it was written. Rather, it draws on the late 19th century sexological category of the invert, a figure who combines elements of psychological and physiological gender inversion with same-sex desire. Noting several tropes characteristic of trans narrative, including a mirror scene, Stephen's repeated claims that she feels like and should have been a man, and her sense of alienation from her female body, Prosser claims The Well of Loneliness as, in fact, the first transgender novel. Rather than be drawn into this debate about whether it depicted a proto-lesbian or a proto-trans sensibility, I'd like to focus on the novel's deployment of the concept of sexual inversion and the ways in which the tensions and ambiguities of this concept played out historically, both in 1928, when the novel was first published and banned, and in 1949, when it was re-released. In her analysis of Hall and other lesbian modernist writers' intent in utilising sexological theories such as inversion in their fiction, Laura Doan suggests that this was a knowledgeable and sophisticated engagement with new thinking about gender and sexuality, which should be understood as part of a broader process of constructing modern lesbian identity, which was underway in the interwar period. 2 decades later, when the novel was again made available to the British public, that process had moved on. And we can see this so examining literary reviews and media coverage of the trial in 1928, Doan points to the wide variety of terms drawn from sexological, moral, cultural discourses which were utilised in the press, including inversion, homosexuality, intermediate sex, perversion, more commonly vague terms such as abnormality, sexual vice, and the mystery of sex. So there's a whole plethora of words that are being used in very vague terms in 1928. She argues that this linguistic diversity points to the indeterminacy of concepts of gendered and sexual identity in the interwar period, when only a small minority of the educated elite were familiar with sexological categories. However, by the late 1940s and early 1950s, the disparate and ill-defined language of this earlier period had begun to cohere around 2 more distinct and widely understood concepts: female homosexuality and lesbianism. So it was into this somewhat altered landscape that Radcliffe Hall's 1928 novel was reissued, drawing the now increasingly outmoded concept of sexual inversion back into the post-war definitions of the lesbian. Chapman's recollections of how she understood The Well of Loneliness highlight the tensions and definitional indeterminacies of this newly emerging category, lesbianism, in the early 50s. She reflected, "I remember these terrible feelings that this woman Stephen has and all her frustrations because she's not a man and because she loves a woman. And yet all her finest feelings, all her love, everything is just dirty and desecrated, and she can't talk about it, and it's secret." And I thought, yes, this is me. This is it. And of course, it also sold me the idea that all lesbians were masculine and tall and handsome and Stephenish. I didn't think of lesbians as being sort of ordinary women. I thought they were all very masculine. And then I thought to myself, well, that's what lesbianism is all about. It's not really homosexuality, it's a form of heterosexuality, in that there are some women who feel themselves to be men inside and are therefore attracted to women, and that is what lesbianism is. So for Chapman, the character of Stephen combined the 2 elements she identified in her own subjectivity: a passionate love for women and a male gender identity. Understanding the novel as a lesbian story, Chapman interpreted psychic masculinity as central to lesbianism, and this initial reading of same-sex desire and gender inversion as entangled enabled her to locate her subjectivity within the category lesbian as she understood it in the 1950s and early 60s. On the basis of this self-categorization, like many middle-class educated British lesbians in the post-war decades, Diana Chapman sought further information through the range of popular psychology books on homosexuality which appeared at this time. She recalled that she had a stack of those blue pelicans and noted in her Hall Carpenter and Women Like Us interviews that her reading had prompted her to, as she put it, take a cure, an attempt without success to be interested in men. A more lasting effect of this literature, however, was in framing Chapman's interpretations of her gendered and sexual selfhood, providing her with concepts and language through which to characterize herself. Her accounts made frequent mention of questions of maturity and neuroticism in line with medical thinking about lesbianism at the time. More broadly, her personal testimonies repeatedly draw on a range of psychological frameworks reflecting the blending of psychoanalytic and older congenital models of sexuality apparent in the medical literature of the 50s and 60s. Chapman's 1963 letter to 20th century indicates the influence of late 19th and early 20th century sexological ideas of inversion or congenital homosexuality on her thinking. And this is most starkly presented in her claim that I myself do not believe that there is any such thing as homosexuality. I believe that male is always attracted to female, but that the body does not always correspond to the sex experienced. What I do wish to emphasize is that being as I am, homosexuality would involve feeling emotional towards a male, and to me it is more natural to regard men simply as other human beings, but to react strongly towards certain types of femininity. So in this early account, Chapman frames gender inversion as intrinsically connected with same-sex desire. Reflecting later in the letter on the causes of homosexuality, she poses a physiological explanation following interwar sexologists and pointing toward the possibility of hormonal imbalances. Ultimately, she rejects the notion of a cure regarding homosexuality as congenital. So responding to the rhetorical question, why do so many of us not want to be cured? She asserts, it is because our sexual nature is part of our character, our intrinsic selves. If I were a feminine woman happily married to a nice husband, I wouldn't be me, nor would I be the person my friends appear to quite like. I might be happier, more contented, less frustrated, less saddened by the pain of unassuaged love, but I would be unrecognizable to myself. In insisting on her sexuality and gender identity as firmly entangled in her broader self, Chapman echoed the accounts of inverts and others who corresponded with sexologists at the turn of the century. So it's a long heritage that she's drawing on here. 8 years later, when drafting her emotional autobiography for Charlotte Woolf, Chapman drew on a different framework. Writing for a psychologist, she gave psychological ideas a prominent place in her account, but drew primarily on the psychoanalytic explanatory models which were gaining influence in Britain in the decades after the war. Her autobiography began, those who are even superficially acquainted with psychology will, on reading this brief summary of my life, find in it a textbook case of maladjustment. Insecurity is there, a lack of proper mother love, perhaps an over-identification with my father. In the following pages, she dwelt at length on her separation anxiety and other deficiencies in her family relationships. The childhood episode with the boy next door was also recast in Freudian terms. So Chapman explained, next door lived two boys of about my age who weren't averse to climbing onto the garden wall and urinating. For the first time, or at least the first time it took on any significance, I saw this interesting pink protuberance. I remember distinctly thinking, it isn't fair. In brackets, the classical Freudian penis envy. No one has yet explained why all girls do not suffer from this. I think that until this time I was living in a sort of infant fool's paradise. Sexual differentiation had never entered my head. Now suddenly the basic difference between my own body and that of a male was thrust upon me. I realized that I was, of all things, a girl. I was appalled, affronted. So utilizing Freud's theory of penis envy, Chapman reframed this moment of epiphany, not as a realization that she was a boy born in the wrong body, but that she was a girl who lacked the superior body and social status of the boy next door. This social reading of gender difference was confirmed by a subsequent account of her resentment of her cousin Eric, who she felt seemed to me to personify masculine freedom and physical prowess, whereas I was bogged down in the restriction of petty femininity from which, by virtue of my physical sex, not even age would free me. By the 1980s, Chapman had revised her analysis of female subordination again in the light of feminism. Throughout the 1970s, Sappho had been developing a new lesbian positionality located between the women's liberation movement and gay liberation and articulated through a more assertive politics. Chapman's regular contributions to Sappho chart her engagement with theories of women's social oppression and her reading of key feminist literature of the period. In a more hopeful account for her Women Like Us interview, she suggested that the women's movement offered a recognition and challenge to gender inequalities, which accorded with her own experience. She said later on in the 70s, "I was pleased that things I had been thinking for a lifetime were now beginning to be thought of as part of the women's movement. The whole business of the way women had been subordinated and stereotyped was beginning to be questioned. So I thought the women's movement was an extremely good thing." What appears to have been missing from Diana Chapman's cultural framework in the 1950s and 1960s, but does appear in her thinking later in life, was the emerging concept of transsexuality, first used in its current sense by US Dr. David Caldwell in 1949. As yet only being debated in medical journals, but not in the broader forum of the Pelican Popular Psychology series, Chapman would have been unlikely to encounter this new medical category while conducting research into homosexuality in her early adulthood. Prosser, Hausman, and others note the importance of trans autobiography in providing a cultural script for others to lay claim to a trans identity. So in post-war Britain, readers would most likely have encountered these narratives in the form of autobiographical features in the popular press, such as Roberta Cowell's account in Picture Post, or early biographical texts such as Man into Woman, which told the story of Danish painter Einar Wegener. There is no evidence that Chapman saw these, however, and the first suggestion that she might have read trans narratives is in a review she authored for Sappho of Jan Morris's 1974 autobiography, Conundrum. It's a largely sympathetic review, which makes a distinction between those for whom a shift in social attitudes offering greater independence for women would resolve dissatisfaction with their role, and a transsexual, and I'm quoting here, by which I mean someone who holds a passionate and ineluctable belief that she's been born into the wrong sex, and for whom only a sex change operation will suffice. And interestingly, Chapman moves on very quickly from Morris's experience. So it's ostensibly a review of Morris's book, but in fact, it is a reflection on what it might mean for someone born in a woman's body to seek to go beyond life as a masculine woman and to choose a sex change operation. It's not obvious from the review where Chapman understood herself to stand in relation to this choice, but it does seem clear that she'd given the question careful thought. In the following years, Sappho printed a number of other pieces on the theme of transsexuality, including an article entitled Transsexual Liberation and a letter from a reader, Kay, announcing, "During this year, I've come to realize that I am a transsexual and not a lesbian." So there's clearly other discussions going on around her at this time around transsexuality. Chapman used the word transsexual to describe herself on at least 2 occasions afterwards. The first instance came in 1980. Caught up in a debate in Sappho about whether contributors should be coming out and allowing their full names to be printed in the magazine, Chapman asserted, "My policy has always been that I wouldn't deny my homo or trans sexuality if asked, but I do not proclaim it." A year later, in her Hall Carpenter interview, she included in her account of her 5-year-old self's encounter with the boy next door the comment, "But from then on, I became a transsexual, really, you see. I saw myself as a boy." As Chapman's final recorded testimony was created only a few years later, and we have no evidence of how she understood herself in the final decades of her life, it's unclear whether her thinking underwent further change. However, these brief references in the early 80s seem to indicate that as she became aware of the emerging category of transsexuality, and as cultural shifts occurred in the meanings of lesbian and transsexual, Chapman made use of new ways to articulate her subjectivity. So, what can we take from this case study of Diana Chapman? I want to finish by highlighting 3 points. Firstly, I think that Chapman's accounts demonstrate the ongoing entanglement of gender, sex, and sexuality in the early post-war decades. Chapman herself understood her masculine subjectivity and her love of women to be interlinked, blending them together, albeit in slightly different ways, in all her accounts. What's more, she was clearly not unusual in this regard. Her construction of a lesbian selfhood, which combined a male gender identity with same-sex desire, made sense to many of those around her. Esme Langley read her 1963 statement in 20th Century that male is always attracted to female, but that the body does not always correspond to the sex experienced, and sought her out as a potential collaborator in establishing Britain's first lesbian magazine. Charlotte Wolfe selected Chapman's emotional autobiography from a sample of 106 to be one of 3 which she presumably considered exemplary of the lesbian psyche, explicitly commenting on what she termed Chapman's male gender identity as evidence of a psychological cause of homosexuality. While other evidence from the 60s indicates that a broad spectrum of lesbian subjectivities and self-presentations existed within the category lesbian, Diana Chapman's understanding of her own homosexuality as caused by gender inversion not only fit that category, but was considered by some to be exemplary of it. By the 1980s, however, her accounts show how shifting cultural, political, and scientific discourses were separating out constructions of gender, sex, and sexuality. It no longer seemed so self-evident to Chapman that her male gender identity and her love of women indicated a lesbian identity, and she was beginning to try out the category transsexual as a possible descriptor for her sense of self. Secondly, Chapman's reframing of her subjectivity across the different accounts emphasizes that constructing selfhood is an ongoing process which occurs throughout the life course. By scrutinizing the shifts in language and emphasis across 2 decades of her personal testimonies, we can see how Diana Chapman's encounters with a variety of texts, from The Well of Loneliness to popular psychology books, trans autobiography, and post-68 feminist discourse, offered new cultural scripts on which to draw in making sense of her subjectivity. The contributions to Sappho in the 1970s demonstrate that she was not alone in this, and that others were also responding to these cultural shifts in a variety of ways. And finally, I want to note that class is an important part of this story. For middle-class women like Diana Chapman, books which could be withdrawn from public libraries or purchased from high street bookshops offered the most readily available sources of knowledge, and the concepts presented therein shaped their possibilities for articulating selfhood. Alternative frameworks for understanding gendered and sexual subjectivity, such as discourses of sex change in the popular press, butch femme identities in the bar culture, may have coexisted, but they typically reached a working class audience. Additionally, it's clear from Chapman's accounts that private ideas of gender and sexual subjectivity were often held in tension with class-specific notions of appropriate and decent behaviour, which powerfully shaped individuals' choices regarding their expressions of selfhood. So her accounts offer a tantalising glimpse of the complex notions of gender, sex, and sexuality in the decades after the Second World War, and demonstrate, I think, the importance of taking this period on its own terms, rather than seeking to impose our current categories on it. Thank you.